evening, everybody, and welcome to this third edition in Series 14 of Have We Got Planning News for You. As you can see, I'm not Charlie Banner, and my name is Mary Cook, and I'm sitting in the town legal offices where I am pleased to be able to join you as tonight's host. And as ever, we encourage you to make a modest donation to one of our charities, the Save Me Trust, or Shelter, or whichever local charity you prefer. If Charlie was here, he'd be banging the drum quite rightly for Help Ukraine Emergency Appeal. And Winston's Wish is a bereavement charity that we also support. And bereavement is in some of our minds, particularly Chris's mind, because we know he's lost a dear colleague of his recently, Chris Barth. So we remember him in this episode. Keen, avid viewers will have noticed we have a new blonde on the show tonight, and we're pleased to welcome Thea Osmund-Smith. No, Paul, no. Who is joining our panel today instead of Charlie. And she'll introduce herself in a moment. But first, can I welcome Phill Bamford, the Director of Policy at the Land and Development Federation, to the show, who's our special guest, and we very much look forward to Chris's interview with him in a short moment. But first, can I also just say thank you very much, listeners, because without your continued support and participation in this show, we wouldn't be here. So we never take you for granted, and we thank you for listening. So let's come back to you, Phill. Where are you? What is your theme for the show, and what are you drinking?
Hi, everybody, and hi, Mary. I'm coming to you from the only local authority not covered by the Greater Manchester Spatial Plan. Those who don't know, it is Stockport. Stockport, indeed, and the home of the Mighty Hatters. I have a wee Gram in my hand, a wee whiskey from the Mura distillery in Sweden, sadly now lost. And in terms of theme, I've picked a theme of folk music, and in particular a band that I've been to see 17 times now, I think, called I Am Glute. So for those who are Mancunians, they may know them. For the most, it'll be a fairly obscure band.
Well, it's lovely to have you on the show. Now, where's Thea gone? I can't see her on my screen. Maybe she's disappeared.
She's there.
Brilliant. Introduce yourself, Thea. Tell us where you are, what you're drinking.
Good. Well, hello. Thank you so much, all of you, for having me. It's a pleasure to join you this evening. I'm actually away on holiday at the moment, and rather than drinking a pina colada out of a pineapple, I am drinking Vimto. And the reason this is the most tenuous link to Phil's theme ever, because Vimto was actually produced for the first time in Manchester in the early 1900s. So that's the excuse for what I'm drinking this evening.
Well, it's lovely to have you with us, and well done. You go to the top of the class for that very good segue from Phil's theme to the drink in your hand. Well done. So, Chris, how are you? Over to you.
I'm very well. Thank you, Mary, and Thea, welcome aboard. I am in Leicester, and most particularly, I'm there.
Yeah.
Lots of interest in Leicestershire right now. And for the theme, folk music, look at this. Look at that.
Oh.
Hey, that's the lead singer of your band, Manchester Folk, making it all the way to Regency Cheltenham, where I picked that up the other day. I tell you what, I quite like that. I always like it when people introduce new music to me, and I think that's fantastic. I Am the Sky is my favourite song on that track when you're listening to it. And then, yeah, Mary, if I could just briefly mention Chris Barth, a very well-known architect at BPTW, sadly passed away recently at the very tender age of 43. A really talented young man, won awards with his work at Rochester Riverside, really cared about what he was doing, and a real pleasure to work with, and very, very sadly missed by everybody at that firm, and actually hundreds of people who knew him. So just thinking about Chris today.
Thank you very much. Paul, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Mary. Obviously, welcome on board, Thea. You have my love and support, Chris, in relation to that last observation.
In terms of what I've got on my background, nobody apart from Phill will recognise it because this is the Sky at Night album from I Am Clute. And to make sure that I'm continuing the theme, I have my guitar. So if anybody wants a song in a few minutes, I'm more than welcome.
Ooh.
No, I'm not going to. And then in terms of what I'm drinking, I left it down to my wife to buy me something interesting. And she's bought me Yorkshire pudding beer, which sounds suitably folk music-ish. I need a beard on it. But I am going to sample this and watch the look of horror as I taste it. So cheers, Phill. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming on the show. Cheers, Thea. Thank you for stepping in.
When I think of Manchester and beer, I think of Boddington's. I love Boddington's excellent stout. I used to drink it when I was pregnant with my first child, which I probably shouldn't really be confessing to, but anyway, there we go. Now, lovely Sasha, how have you managed to do any work today in between all the exciting cricket stuff going on? What with India, shocker, and Pakistan? Yeah.
I did enjoy the 46 all out. That was very enjoyable. But I was looking, I had to ask Phill, I've got to admit something. My musical knowledge is so comprehensive and extensive, I had to ask others what your theme was, because frankly, I didn't have a Scooby. But I also wanted to say, and see if you can guess this, last time Stockport County beat Arsenal, 1914. Long may it continue. Long may it continue.
We're season ticket holders at Stockport County, and that's my son's dream tie is Stockport versus Arsenal. Sadly, it's never happened.
Oh, well, you never know. Well, I'll do you a deal. If we get that dream tie, I will see you there, which will be fun. I
thought you were going to say you'd buy him a drink or buy him
I will absolutely. I'll buy him I Am Clute.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you all. It's lovely to see you all. And we start with me. I'm doing the news update, and I wanted to focus on this week's speech by our new Prime Minister. I still think of him as being new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, when he introduced here down in the city, effectively the consultation on Invest 2035, the UK's modern industrial strategy. He made a speech this week, and it's just, I think, quite interesting. He identified 8 growth-driving sectors: advanced manufacturing, big in your part of the world, Chris, where you are at the moment, clean energy industries, creative industries, defence, digital and technologies, financial services, life sciences, and professional and business services. So if anybody's making applications in those areas, they should be quoting, I suggest, from what Sir Keir had to say about the importance of driving growth in those sectors forward. And he emphasised that the objective of his industrial strategy is to unleash, as he says, the full potential of cities and regions. And that's definitely a theme, isn't it? This thing about cities and regions. And he talked about high potential clusters and city regions, mayoral combined authorities. Again, the emphasis is on devolving significant powers to these combined authorities to enable them to have the tools that they need. So I think that's interesting. The other interesting thing is the point that we have to wait until the spring 2025 spending review to really understand the money that is going to be put into the industrial strategy and growth driving those sectors. But I fancy that we will see some more mayoral development corporations. I mean, Phill, by the way, you're in an area where, curiously, Stockport has a development corporation, although it's one without planning powers. So I wanted to draw attention to that. He also had a bit of a go about the DCO challenges to DCOs, and mentioned in particular East Anglia, the East Anglia 2 wind farm, which has been the subject of litigation. But I thought that was an interesting segue into this point. You will remember that our own dear Charlie was commissioned to produce a report about that very topic. in particular, he was asked to lead a review to explore whether NSIPs were being unduly held up by inappropriate legal challenges. So it's interesting that Sakir has a go at the system, but has yet to publish our Charlie's report. So there's my update. And without further ado, we turn to our first case. Paul, you are going to tell us all about this High Court challenge involving Farnham Town Council and the importance of serving Section 288 claims within time. Over to you.
You just ruined it. That's the spoiler.
Sorry.
I was building up to that point. There was going to be a great reveal in 5 minutes' time. Right, okay, so it's a case about process, but that shouldn't result in anybody turning off the screen. This is really interesting and, more importantly, really, really important. And on the winning side was some bloke called Sasha White. Never heard of him. I'm sure he's an upcoming barrister, interesting bloke. It's a decision of Tim Smith, who is a partner at Brian Cave Leighton Paisner, sitting as a Deputy High Court Judge on the 4th of October. And it's an interesting decision because it's a really, really important lesson, and I'll build up to the lesson in a moment, notwithstanding what I've just said about Mary's spoiler. So it's a challenge to the decision of an inspector who allowed an outline permission for 146 dwellings on a site near Farnham on the edge of the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty on the 3rd of July of last year. So far, so straightforwardly. Initially, Waverley Borough Council, who were the authority that refused planning permission for this and actually a number of preceding applications on the site, considered bringing a challenge, but then towards the end of the 6-week period for the statutory challenge, decided not to. When it decided not to, the town council considered whether it wanted to step into the breach and decided very much late in the day that it wanted to do so, essentially on the grounds that they wanted to challenge the inspector's approach to a particular policy in the neighbourhood plan. There were two grounds of challenge, but they were both running arguments about the interpretation of FNP 10C of the neighbourhood plan. But that's not the substantive point that the case raises, because what it really is a case about Section 288, open brackets, for capital B, which everybody on the screen will know, and everybody listening will know, but I'll remind everybody just in case. That requires a challenge to an inspector's decision to be brought, which means commenced and served within 6 weeks, starting on the day after the date of the decision. So the statute itself says commenced and served in terms of the proceedings 6 weeks after the date of the decision. Now, in the modern age, served means sending the papers to the on a 288, it means sending the papers to the Secretary of State's solicitors, the Government Legal Department, GLD as they're known to their friends. So it's by email, so you no longer have to run around with the papers anymore, but you've got to make sure that they're commenced and served by 4 o'clock according to the statute. Well, unfortunately, this was a case which failed to be issued in August, and there was a change of solicitor because somebody was away on holiday. And in the absence of a colleague, the proceedings were issued just in time and served just before 4 o'clock on the 14th of August, essentially the last day of challenge. So they were issued in court on that date. In other areas of litigation, that would have given you a few days to serve the proceedings on the other side. However, that's not the case in relation to challenges under Part 54 of the CPR for challenges under Section 288, which is actually silent. The rules don't say anything about power to extend time. The practice direction doesn't say that. So the only thing you really got to go on is the statute. So once it was realised that they hadn't been served in time, albeit about 4 days afterwards, once it was realised, there was an application to extend time for service. Now, if this had been a judicial review, there would be a power to extend time for service. So the way in which Tim Smith, sitting as a Deputy High Court Judge, approached it was to ask 3 questions. Firstly, could you do that? Is there a power to extend time? And secondly, to ask the question, if there is, should you extend time in the circumstances? And then the third question was, if you should extend time, what would be the outcome of the challenge? It was a rolled up hearing for the exciting lawyers on the webcast. Well, the most important bit was the could you extend time? There's been quite a lot of litigation in relation to this area. revolving around a case in 2022 called the Crown on the Application of Good Law against the Secretary of State for Health. There've been a couple of other cases in the planning context involving Telford, Holton and Welwyn Garden City. But it all revolved around whether or not there was such a power. The short point is that Judge Smith, after hearing this and considering competing dicta in the respective cases, did consider that there wasn't actually a power to extend the time for service, and said essentially the statute means what it says. But what he then did, and this is why, frankly, it is a really good judgment and a really sensible judgment, and make sure that nobody walks away from the case believing that they haven't had a proper say, is he then went on to say, if there was a power, should I have extended time? And he concluded that no, that the excuses were essentially the fault of the lawyers in the case, and that wasn't a good enough reason to extend time. That's where the red light goes off and the lawyers make sure you know Section 2884 capital B. So he said, even if there had been a power, I wouldn't have extended time, and then went on to say, but if that I would have extended time, I would have granted permission because it was a rolled up hearing, but I wouldn't have allowed the application. So he went on to deal with the substantive application itself and gave a judgment, which means that there was no point in going upstairs to challenge the could you if there was no argument against the should you or the actual substantive. So it's a really, really good judgment. It's a really well-reasoned judgment. It's actually, as a lawyer, this makes me sound utterly tragic, notwithstanding the rather nice beer I'm drinking. It's an enjoyable judgment to read, but the big, big message is, if you issue proceedings on the very last day of the 6 weeks, make sure you issue and you also email a copy to the Secretary of State. Otherwise, you need to dust off your insurance.
Thank you very much, Paul. I mean, it's everyone's worst nightmare, isn't it? August challenges, vacation periods. People do always, not always, but people do sometimes get confused between the difference between a 288 and a JR in terms of the issue and the service point. It's a mistake, I'm afraid, that's easily made unless you're doing this sort of thing routinely, day in, day out.
Now, I've actually set it to music, Mary. I don't know if you want me to.
No. But the other interesting thing is that, planning solicitors, because Tim Smith is is also, in practice as a great planning solicitor. It's just interesting to note that you don't have to be a barrister to become a High Court judge.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Now, Thea, you are going to take us to Melksham.
I am, yes. And this is another case or section involving a little-known barrister on this occasion, one Mr. Chris Young KC.
We do cover other cases, people. I just want to say that.
But this was a scheme for 53 affordable dwellings just south of Melksham, which is identified as a market town in the development plan, and it's a site that's north of Berryfield, which is a village. It is outside of the settlement boundaries of Wiltshire's core strategy, and there was a neighbourhood plan at play here too, which was adopted in 2021 and didn't allocate the site for housing. Now, you'll see, of course, from the first page that's on your screen now that permission was granted. But before we get into that and the reasons for it, there's some important context to be aware of first. Because when this site first went to committee, originally in November 2023, it was recommended for approval. And that's not unusual. But what's unusual here is members accepted that recommendation and delegated resolved to delegate the matter to the head of development management to grant planning permission subject to appropriate conditions and the final 106. Then came the December changes to the framework, which meant that because the council had submitted its plan for examination, it only had to demonstrate a 4-year supply of housing land. And so the council set about reviewing lots of schemes for major development in its area and took them all back to committee. Now, surprise, surprise, when the application went back to committee, it was recommended for refusal and was refused. So Terra Strategic Land appealed. But that's not the end of the story. There is another twist in this tale, because a month before the appeal was heard, there was another appeal decision in Wiltshire that found that the council couldn't demonstrate a 4-year housing land supply. And so the council withdrew its objection and didn't contest the appeal. But of course, the appeal having been lodged and accepted by the inspectorate, it was still going ahead, and the parish council continued to object as a third party. Now, there's another important point of context for this site, and it's this, that in May 2022, permission was granted for 50 affordable dwellings on the adjacent field, following an appeal also by Terra Strategic. And the council did fight this appeal on that occasion, and the issues were a little bit broader, but permission was granted anyway, as you'll see again from the screenshot that you've got on your screen now. Notwithstanding that there was a conflict with a neighbourhood plan, the same neighbourhood plan at play in the most recent appeal decision, and that plan had been adopted just the previous year in 2021. And you'll see in a moment the relationship between the two sites. There you are on screen. The site to the east that was the subject of the earlier appeal was actually under construction at the time that the appeal on the western part of the site, or phase 2 as it was called, went before the inspector. So back to this appeal, the main issues were whether or not the location is suitable for housing, the housing land supply with particular reference to affordable housing, and finally the planning balance. And on the first issue, the inspector found that the location, being outside of the settlement boundary as it was, led to a conflict with the spatial strategy and of course the neighbourhood plan, and that was something that attracted significant weight against the proposal. And interestingly, that's in pretty stark contrast to the earlier inspector for phase 1, who in the same circumstances and the same policy context found only limited harm in that respect. So an interesting one to see how two decision takers can take a different approach but ultimately arrive at the same conclusion. On the second issue, unsurprisingly, the inspector found that the provision of affordable housing on the site would attract significant weight. And interestingly, at paragraph 34 of the decision, responded to, let's call it, a thinly veiled criticism, presumably from the parish council, that 100% affordable development in this location of over 100 dwellings would not provide an appropriate housing mix. Now, the inspector responded to that in pretty strong terms, as you can see there, saying that there can be no reasonable stigma attached to an affordable housing development. And it's good to see an inspector seeing through that sort of criticism for what it really is, and a criticism that anyone promoting 100% affordable housing schemes tend to face. Another interesting point is on the framework at paragraph 55 of the decision, because the inspector said there, again, as we might expect, and I think has been said in other appeal decisions as well, that the draft framework carries limited weight given where it's at the moment, the consultation having just closed. But he did draw a distinction with the July written ministerial statement, because that, he said, is an expression of government policy, and that his decision was consistent with how the planning system is expected to tackle these issues. So, in conclusion, the inspector found that on a tilted balance, on a flat balance, and as well as having regard to paragraph 14 of the framework, in light of the neighbourhood plan and the potential conflict there, the very significant combined benefits of the appeal outweighed the harm. So congratulations to Chris on that site, and of course all who were involved in that appeal process.
Thank you very much, Thea. That was very clear and very interesting, and extra research digging out that the 2022 appeal decision. Well done. And now we delve into a development consent with the help of Sasha, who's going to tell us all about the Immington roll-off, roll-on decision.
I am. And before I do, I'm just going to let our viewers into a little secret. Whenever I give someone else a DCO, the moaning about having to read 700 pages. So I gave Chris one, I gave Mary one, I gave him Paul one. So I thought on Saturday morning, I better be fair for once and practice what I preach. So I gave myself the Immington DCO. Yes. So obviously DCO. Now let's just have £1,000 on was the DCO confirmed by the Secretary of State or not. Amazingly, it was confirmed. I think it's quite interesting. This is the DCO for the expansion of Immington Port, and it's quite powerful to note. There was the examining authority with 3 inspectors. It happened last year and concluded earlier this year, as you can see, the examination concluded. And I think what is interesting about this, of course, with DCOs, the overarching point is how seminal the national policy statements are for ports. And what this context is, there is actually a presumption in favour if the criteria is met for port expansion. Now, I'd first of all like to go to paragraph, I think there are two particular paragraphs that are very interesting. The first is paragraph 27, because a rival port, the port of Killingholme, submitted evidence, and the examining authority's conclusions are quite interesting in relation to that, because they concluded that the capacity of Killingholme is not, the exact words, is not as constrained as alleged by the promoters of the DCO, and the applicant's earlier reliance on a dwell time of 2.25 days was excessive, resulting in an underestimation of the Humber's current capacity. And the examining authority therefore considered that any shortage in the Humber's existing unaccompanied ro-ro handling capacity had been overstated by the applicant, and this has implications for the weight to be attached to the applicant's claim that there's compelling and urgent need. So, I mean, in essence, the examining authority were a bit sceptical about the estimate of need, and it's quite powerful in relation to that. And it ends up with a conclusion in paragraph 27 that the examining authority was of the view that the applicant had underestimated the amount of existing capacity on the Humber, and the compelling and urgent need made by the applicant had been exaggerated. It's not often you see that language in a decision notice to assert that, and therefore the need should attract little positive weight in the making of the order. Now, if we go on, and if Rob can work his magic, I'd like to go to paragraph 193, because it's quite interesting what the Secretary of State comes to the view. And you notice that notwithstanding the need, what is actually said by the Secretary of State in this case is that it places substantial weight on the capacity that there would be delivered and the contribution that this would make towards the long-term demand for port capacity for growth in volumes and imports and exports by, say, at the national level, as established effectively by the national policy statement for ports, ensuring the resilience of the national port infrastructure, etc., etc. It's also material to note the Secretary of State notes a discussion on alternatives and is content that from a policy perspective there's no general requirement to consider alternatives, and also that in essence the Secretary of State disagrees with the conclusions on the economic, commercial and economic effects and has placed positive moderate weight. So I think the takeaways from this DCO is it clearly the very, very strong presumptions set out in national policy statements are likely to be pretty determinative of the outcome of DCOs. And also the other point is that you can see the subtlety. The Secretary of State and the new government are quite obviously going to take it upon themselves to disagree with examining authorities if they feel it's in the national interest to do so. So thank you, Mary.
Well, no, thank you, Sasha. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that takes us in a very timely way to Chris's interview with Phill. So I hand over without further ado. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Mary. Phill Bamford doesn't really need any introduction from all of us, working in the development industry and working in the planning sector and with local authorities. You are the Director of Policy at the Land Planning and Development Federation, the LPDF, and you spent the last 29 years in both the private and public sector. You began your career at Broxbourne Borough Council, and you worked for many years preparing development plans and other planning documents there and at Manchester City, Vale Royal, Tameside, Cheshire West and Chester councils, and I think responsible primarily for the plans that were brought forward at Vale Royal and Cheshire West, Phill. So a huge amount of experience in the public sector. Then you went to work for a leading land promoter, I think we can call them Gladman, heading up their planning policy and land promotion team and learning quickly, you say, about the commercial and practical realities of the development industry. 2021, you took up your current role at the LPDF, and you represent many of the country's largest land promoters, carrying out and coordinating a lot of the national research that we see. We see plenty of that being sponsored and put forward by the land promoters alongside what the HBF also does, and speaking and liaising with government departments, politicians, stakeholders, etc. And outside of work, I love this, you live your failed sporting career through your son Thomas, who's a keen cricketer. I think that applies to plenty of us, if I may say so. And you were an ex-chef as well. A very interesting guy, a very popular man, if I may say so, Phill, in the industry. And what I wanted to start with, if I may, is what is your role at the LPDF? What do you do specifically in your day job most of the time?
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for that introduction. Yeah, well, the LPDF was established around 6 years ago. Still a very young organisation, but the growth over time has been beyond expectations, really, and that's down to the leadership of Paul Brocklehurst, who many of you will know, and also the skills of the rest of the team, Nicole, Eve, and Lucy, to take that organisation forward. I joined 3 years ago to replace the legend that is John Akers, who many and most will know. And my main responsibilities, as you said, were as to respond to many of the consultations, particularly national consultations on planning policy on behalf of our members, but also some local consultations where they raise national issues. You've seen the depth of information that we go into on those consultation responses, just making sure that we provide as positive response to government as we can, and as much information and positive kind of solutions to some of the problems that those changes might make, and improvements that government can make to those particular consultations to ensure they operate properly. As you quite rightly said, I lead the research and a lot of the research documents that we do alongside various organisations utilising our affiliates, but alongside our friends at the Home Builders Federation. And some that we've done recently, we've been concentrating particularly on the role of SME developers and how we can enhance that role to deliver more housing units and help the government achieve its targets. We interact on a regular basis with MPs, with civil servants, with think tanks, with other national stakeholders, like, for example, PINS, that we meet on a regular basis. And then, obviously, I liaise with members to understand fully their concerns and the hurdles that are having to overcome. So I'm fully informed when I go and see government and civil servants about the difficulties that our members are facing on a daily basis.
Okay, terrific. I noticed actually that Paul Brocklehurst has had his hand up throughout the entire thing. He's just poised for a question, Phill, as if Paul would do that. So who do you speak to in government? Because we're all really interested in this. Who do you get to speak to?
A variety of people across government. Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking to ministers, to MPs, and to peers from all parties to talk about the issues of housing delivery and the planning system. And we interact on a regular basis with the civil service. And particularly, obviously, MHCLG as the lead authority or the lead organisation for planning, but also HM Treasury, because Treasury have a big input and a big influence on what happens within planning policy. And we try and inform them of both. It's a two-way conversation when we do have those interactions. We try and inform them of what's happening in the planning world and in the land market. Whilst they ask us detailed questions about how particular initiatives that they either have introduced or are wanting to introduce might impact on those systems. On more specific issues, we talk to various organisations outside of government and other government departments like DEFRA and Number 10 or Number 10 on a lesser basis. About kind of key specific issues. So nutrient neutrality, for example, has been a big issue for many, and we've been speaking with DEFRA and Natural England and those kinds of organisations on a regular basis. And then this is a shameless plug. We've got our annual policy conference coming up on the 26th of November, at which Matthew Pennycook has very kindly given some of his time to come and address that particular conference. We engage right up to that level.
Okay, what was that date again, Phil? I didn't quite catch that.
26th of November.
All right, thank you very much. Interesting. I thought that you were talking to the Treasury as well, because the Treasury is very interested, isn't it, in what the development industry can do and can help us at this time. Okay, well, you obviously lead on the consultation and the research and so on. So the obvious thing that we've got you here to talk about is the MPPF. And I just want to put you right on the spot and say, what is your view about the proposed changes to the MPPF? Good thing or bad thing?
Well, I think the first thing to say, from our point of view, you can see from the response that we gave to our consultation, it's very positive.
Yeah.
We were particularly impressed with the government's speed in terms of handling the MPPF changes. They were out very, very quickly and probably have gone further than we anticipated they might have done, given the length of time they had to put those in place. But we were very positive about the changes that they put forward. We recognise that there might be some areas, and we put forward some additional wording and some tweaks that could be made to those to make them hopefully more effective in implementation. But we tried to be as positive as we possibly can be. In particular, the reversal of a majority of the 2023 changes that the previous government made was very welcome and very well received by the industry. A couple of areas that we suggested they could have gone a little bit further on. The changes to greenbelt policy and the introduction of grey belt, obviously, again, we feel that needs probably a little bit of tweaking, but certainly something that is very, very positively received by the development sector, and something that we're operating on already to try and help the government achieve its targets. I think from an overall point of view, it's a massive step forward. Certainly from where we were in 2023, and probably even from the position that was introduced in 2012 through the MPPF. So very, very positively received by industry. You can see that from our representation.
No, that's really interesting. A massive step forward, obviously needed to get to 300,000 homes a year and lots of other things, economic development, but also you saying probably better and bigger than the 2012 version of the MPPF, with its significantly boost the supply of housing. That's an interesting observation from somebody who knows all about it from both sides of the fence. Okay, lots of positives, but what are the shortcomings?
Clearly there are shortcomings, and I think from our point of view there is a couple of missed opportunities that the government haven't quite addressed fully through this particular document. For example, particularly support for SME developers. But one element where we think that the government really have missed a trick is the incorporation of some of those elements that they set out in the written ministerial statement into the actual document, the MPPF document itself, to fully emphasise the government's targets and objectives within the MPPF itself, so that the remainder of the document is framed within that overall context. I think that's something that they could do, something that the 2012 MPPF did with Greg Clark forward to that particular document. I think the transitional arrangements need tightening up. I think there's a blog by another barrister this morning talking about the transitional arrangements, and particularly saying that if we're serious about delivery and we want delivery as quickly as this government do, then those transitional arrangements need tightening up as tight as possible. We need to get to a point where we are delivering against the new numbers as quickly as humanly possible. I think on affordable housing delivery, which is something that this government is really kind of particularly focused on, they could have gone further in supporting and explicitly supporting and giving substantial weight to affordable housing delivery and particularly social rent delivery on schemes. And then from our point of view, a word of caution about the unintended consequences of bringing in benchmark land values at this particular stage. You know, if you introduce that in the wrong way, then certainly you can undo some of the good work that, or most of the good work that the MPPF changes have brought about.
Yeah. And neighbourhood planning, do you think that needs to be looked at?
I think it does. Yeah, I think certainly going.
That's a leading question, Phill. Boy.
Yes, going back to the 2023 pre-2023 changes would be the way to go.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of change there, but you've identified some problems, particularly those transitional arrangements, if you can understand them. I mean, what needs to happen in your view for the government to deliver 1.5 million homes in the next 4 3/4 years? What's got to happen?
I think from our point of view, we've got to say first that we recognise and support the government's re-emphasis of a plan-led system. That's really important, and it's something, countrywide coverage of local plans and strategic plans is something that we should all be aiming to achieve, but that's not going to be done in the first 5 years. We've had research done that says, potentially 25% of local plans, local authorities are going to have up-to-date local plans by 2025. So it's going to be the development management process that does the heavy lifting in the first 3 to 5 years of the NPPF. Therefore, the government needs to ensure that the decision-making elements of the NPPF, for example, Para 11, is as clear, concise and positive as possible. And that's to give confidence to the market to submit planning applications, confidence to investors to invest in delivery and development, and to give confidence to decision makers that they are making those positive decisions as expediently as possible. Government need to call in applications where they feel that that's in the national interest, and to do that as expeditiously as they possibly can. And we need to aim high. Those targets that came out through the new standard method, they're high for a reason, because we need to aim high to achieve the levels of development that the government wants to achieve in those first 5 years. But we've got to recognise that these planning changes are only one cog in the wheel of development, and we've got to ensure that resources are aimed towards local planning authorities, towards others that are engaged in the process, so towards statutory consultees, towards PINs, and all of those that are involved in the process to get these developments off the ground with permission and off the ground as quickly as humanly possible.
Yeah. You mentioned the local authorities there. There are lots and lots of fantastic people in local authority working incredibly hard, and you know that from your own experience. But putting the professional officers to one side, there are local authorities that just won't play ball, and they're not going to play ball in the next 5 years either. So what do we do about that? Because that could be the biggest disappointment this government faces, isn't it? A belief that we're going to have lots of plans with new numbers and greenbelt releases, and in fact, it'll be just delays.
Yes, that will happen, but I don't think we should necessarily just look at penalties and penalising those local authorities. I think it's a mix of penalties and incentives for those local authorities to get those local plans in place and achieve the government's targets. I think in terms of intervention powers, those powers have always been there for ministers to use, and intervention particularly in local plan making, but they've not. Under the previous government, they weren't particularly used extensively, and I think that's something that if local authorities just aren't playing ball, then this government needs to be strong and intervene in those processes and take over those local plan preparations. We do have, obviously, the reintroduction of 5-year land supply and the continuation of HDT, the housing delivery test, the safety nets in the system where problems occur with delivery, but we need to make sure that they're implemented consistently and robustly in decision making, so local authorities are achieving what the government wants to achieve. There can also be financial penalties to local authorities in terms of access to funding, particularly from central government, for big pots of funding to achieve some of the other things that they want to achieve. And if they can't do that without having an up-to-date local plan in place, then that may encourage them to get local plans up and running and adopted. But there's also incentives that you can put in place. I'm certainly from an era where planning delivery grant, which was based on the performance of a planning authority in certain areas, was a real incentive, and certainly got my chief executive banging on my door to say, where's the local plan, Phill? We need this up to date, because this means money coming into authorities. And then there's that whole issue around ring fencing of those fundings, so that when funding does go into local authorities, it is ring fenced for improvements to the planning system as a whole.
Okay, fantastic, Phill. Thank you very much indeed. Paul, do you have a question?
I do. And Phill, just to prove that we're live, you'll be pleased to know that Paul Brocklehurst put his hand up by accident, but appears to have come out as also a folk music fan, saying, and I'm sure this is the subliminal message, that he's a Mike Harding fan. So you've got what to talk about. That may have... I think that's what he said, but I may be mistaken. Anyway, Phill, you and I first encountered each other when both of us were much earlier on in our careers, working in the Northwest, when you were a prominent forward planner in a number of different authorities, Vale Royal, Cheshire West. So tell me what do you miss most and what do you miss least about working for the public sector, particularly forward planning?
I think one of the things that I miss the most about forward planning, and particularly at that time, was the ability to lead a very highly educated, well-informed, committed and knowledgeable team on the local plan that had the support of senior management, that had the support of the members to get that plan in place. They did everything they could to help us in that process. We were well-resourced. We were trying to achieve things that the members wanted to achieve in our particular patch, which was Vale Royal at that particular point in time. And we felt a real professionalism and certainly invested in by our authority to deliver that. And that's something that I miss, and something that probably isn't as prevalent these days as it was in my day. I had a very, very well-resourced team, and I was lucky to have that within local authority. So that's probably what I miss the most. What I definitely don't miss is that kind of local political intervention in the process. Certainly when I was there, it was just creeping into the system where allocated sites in local plans were being refused against officer recommendation and ending up at appeal. And that's something that is far more prevalent, unfortunately today, and something the government could look at through its proposed national scheme of delegation. But that kind of political intervention also got difficult, even where, in fact, my authority was led by politicians of the same colour as the government at the time, but they still didn't feel that they needed to deliver the government's objectives all the time. And that is a real kind of a bugbear of an authority where the members just don't want to or are unwilling to deliver the objectives of the government. So that element of it, I certainly don't miss now I've left the public sector.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Phill.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. Great question. Mary, your question.
Thank you very much, Chris. Phill, I wanted to ask you about SMEs. I spoke at an event last week run by an organisation called the Developers Club, and they and their members are all SMEs. Indeed, they're almost people who are aspiring to be SMEs, if you see what I mean. And we had a discussion about what more could be done to make life easier for those sorts of developers. So I'm interested in your view on that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's something that we've been focusing on at the LPDF over the last couple of years. As Chris alluded to when he said about trying to meet the 1.5 million homes. One thing we've got to ensure is that everybody is delivering. So it's SMEs, it's the big house builders, it's PRS, it's the RPs, it's everybody that is going to have to up their game and deliver against the thing. So it's not just SMEs that need to do this, but SMEs have a huge role to play in increasing delivery across the country. In fact, research that we've done fairly recently alongside Richborough, one of our members, and Savills has shown that SMEs are being starved of sites, particularly, as you quite rightly say, Mary, for those growing SMEs that want to move into delivering slightly larger sites. So they're being starved of sites of between 20 and 250 homes, with sites up to 100 homes halving. The number of sites up to 100 homes halving between 2017 and 2023. So the number of sites that are available there simply needs to be increased. And that can be done in lots of ways to diversify the market across various initiatives. Some of the things that we've suggested is having a separate definition of medium-sized sites within MPPF of we've said up to 250 units. And then there being a focus on the delivery of those through increased weight to those particular sites through the decision-making process. And also through the PPG setting out a percentage of the housing requirement that needs to be allocated through the local plan on those scales of sites. Greater use can be made of planning in principles and possibly looking at extending the permissive style policies that are included in the local plan for those types of sites. And the other thing that's critical is simplifying the evidence-based requirements for small-scale sites, because again, research that we've done in the 1990s, it was about £12,000 to submit an outline planning application for a small site. That would be £28,000 in today's prices, but now it's £125,000 and up to 30 pieces of evidence to support those things. So I think through the PPG and through the validation lists, you can significantly reduce the evidence base required for SME developers to do. There's lots of other things that I could go into on SMEs, but
but I mean, it seems to me that I heard all sorts of stories last week about people who had bought small sites and then were basically sitting there waiting for planning authorities to make decisions. I mean, the big house builders are a lot more sophisticated. They don't buy things up front. They enter into options. But these smaller organisations are not in that luxurious position. So they're hit at both ends. It's really, I think, what I'm trying to say. The planning application process is so burdensome for them. They haven't got small allocated sites. Not sure permitted development rights necessarily help them, because that's still a expensive process in terms of prior notification. So I agree, everyone has to play their part in solving this.
Yeah, well done. I was just going to say, a lot of people were saying exactly what you've just said there, Mary, and congratulating you for that observation. Because to be honest, if you want to know why there's been agglomeration in the house building sector, look at the planning costs and the costs of running planning applications, and then understand why SMEs have been killed off into the thousands of numbers. Anyway, I need to turn to Thea and ask Thea, have you got a question?
I have, and hello, Phil.
Hi, Thea. Well, welcome to your first Have I Got Planning News for You?
Thank you. I think you're outdoing me. Isn't this your second time on?
No. This is the first time. Paul was on previously.
Oh, well, both first timers. Well, that's a good thing. But you were instrumental in the LPDF consultation response to the draft framework. And in that, you encouraged, if I can say, the liberal use of the PPG to refine and expand upon the framework's policies. And my question for you is, what do you see as the opportunities, but also the risks of using the PPG for delivering the framework's objectives?
Yes, we were quite liberal with our kind of advice on the PPG, but the PPG is a really powerful tool for government to use. We all know it can be changed quickly. It can react quickly to issues which arise with MPPF implementation, which obviously, as it goes through its initial phases, is going to crop up quite regularly. It can add detailed guidance on exactly how the government want those policies to be implemented. And I think the government need to do that so that all key actors in the development sector, on public and private sector, understands exactly how those policies should be interpreted and implemented. It can add a level of consistency of approach, so it can set out detailed ways in which certain things can be undertaken, which simplifies the process and obviously helps with the digitization of the planning system if things are done in a consistent manner across the country. There'll obviously be a need to update the PPG immediately upon the publication of the MPPF, because there needs to be an internal consistency between the two documents. So it's something the government have got to do anyway before the NPPF is published. So they need to use that opportunity to look at all the other areas which they can add those additional guidance on. They can also add kind of a standardization approach. One of the things we've suggested is a standardization approach for Greenbelt studies. We've all worked in authorities that do Greenbelt studies in vastly different ways. And that's something that a standard approach to that could be set out in the PPG so that we all know where we're coming from. We can all operate within that system. And again, for digitisation, that's perfect. And things like the duty to cooperate. Whilst we are waiting for the reintroduction of strategic level of planning, the duty to cooperate still needs to function. It's not clear in the NPPF how it does. So the PPG can be used to do that kind of thing. There are risks, obviously, because it can be brought in overnight. There's no need for consultation on the things that it brings in. So those kinds of risks come through because, government can introduce something that not everybody is behind and adheres to. But, that's the risk. But I think it's a really powerful tool that the government should utilise.
Thanks very much, Phill.
Thank you very much, too. Great question. And yeah, it depends on which side of the fence you're on, doesn't it? If the PPG change helps you or doesn't, then you criticise it or you love it. Last but not least, never least, Sasha, do you have a question?
I do, Chris. Thank you. Phill, what I wanted to ask you about is obviously we've got the targets in place. I just want your estimate. We've obviously talked about hitting that target, but what do you see as the consequences if the 1.5 million is not hit and the figure's considerably lower? What are the realities of that failure? What do you envisage would happen in the provision of housing, both in terms of cost, availability and other problems that would accrue?
I mean, I think that the real outcomes of yet more failure is going to be seismic for this country. We're in a housing crisis. We've been in that housing crisis for a decade or so, and not delivering against those targets is going to impact on the UK economy itself, on the outcomes for the population of this country, particularly for young people who've been priced out of the market and unable to access the housing market in the formative years, like I was able to do, which creates obviously intergenerational inequality. We've got a huge backlog of just market housing and affordable housing and rental properties in need, and that failing is leading to obviously increasing housing waiting lists. Certainly with the latest figures, we've seen a huge increase in the cost of temporary accommodation for local authorities. That's up 32% in 2023-24 to £2.3 billion. That's a huge cost for the government to outlay. We see societal issues with that under delivery of housing, such as declining educational attainment, declining health impacts, both of which have a huge impact on people's everyday lives and the economic prosperity of this country. We will continue not to have local plans across the country, that kind of countrywide coverage of local plans, which means obviously we're still having speculative development coming forward. And this is the biggest change in the planning system since 2012. The industry is really positive about these changes and is gearing itself up to help the government achieve the targets that it's setting and its objectives. Getting the planning system operating efficiently is one step in that process. But we've got to make sure that other changes and improvements are made by the end of this Parliament, so that we probably won't hit the 1.5 million in the first 5 years, but we are getting far more closer to that level, up to hopefully 300,000 homes per year by the end of this Parliament, and that's going to have a massive benefit for everybody in this country.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And I must say, Phill, you must be the best prepared guest we've ever had. I think you must have made about 150 points. It's CPD overdrive. You've certainly managed to tell us everything you intended to tell us. It's been brilliant, really fascinating. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. Thank you, Phil. And I mean, we can't fail is the short point. We simply can't fail. Well, we've come to the end of the show in a very timely fashion. Thank you all very much for your invaluable contributions. Special thank you to Phil and Thea for taking part this evening. And we will see you all again on the 7th of November. So enjoy your half terms for those of you who are still young enough to be in that position. And we're back with Rachel Daneman to talk about nutrient neutrality on the 7th of November. Take care.
Thanks all.
All right. Thanks all. Good night.